I think you said this to me some years ago, that you knew that you had picked an art form that was, to some extent, on the wane.
Yeah. Oh, I did say this. Again, it's my father, because I'm like an extension of my father, as we all are extensions of our parents. He, as a child, paid a nickel and saw for the first time a moving image, a train coming down a track in a Nickelodeon. And he was absolutely blown away by that. And what he said to me, and this was in 1975, after I had been divorced and I was miserable, and we were sitting at the bottom of our empty swimming pool in the winter to be out of the wind, and it was facing south, and it was white walls, made it tolerable to be in winter sitting there talking. And I was just absolutely miserable and didn't know what to do with my life. I was divorced, etc. And he told me this story, that he was blown away by the moving image. And then they had celluloid film with, the jerky films, and he thought that was magnificent. And then there was sound, and then the film stabilized, and it wasn't jerky images. And then there was color, and then there was Technicolor, and then there was CinemaScope, and then there was television, etc. And he said to me, and he had never heard of Moore's Law.
In 1975, he said to you.
1975, he said, he had never heard of Moore's Law. He said, I've noticed throughout my life that the amount of information that can be transmitted in various forms, film and then video, etc., has doubled periodically, and it's getting denser and denser and denser. He said, so that the image now is much more translatable and portable, and you can the image is convenient, and it's going to take over from the word. And he said in 1975, I figure you have about 25 years until the image becomes dominant and the word recedes. Now, he was off a bit, but I took that to heart, and I thought to myself, well, maybe I'll have 25 or 30 years in which people are still interested in the word rather than the image. And as we see now, things have been converted to communication, but largely by images. And you see people staring at their phones the way they do, and TikTok and all of that. And the word has receded, language has receded as a means of communication. Of course, it's still there, always will be. But as an art form, as a way of communicating en masse, it has receded in favor of the image. So I knew then that my time was limited.
Well, it's interesting because you just wrote a novel, and you've written another one not yet published or named, but great novels can still be written, and they're still being written. So we're really talking about the appetite, the market, the audience. Mm-hmm. I don't think they can ever disappear. The question is the details.
It's the monastery. It gets small. The audience gets smaller and smaller, and less appreciative, and more, if I dare say so, refined in the technical sense. Fewer and fewer people, and it's the monastery. They will be the words will be preserved, but the general audience and appreciation and power of it is gradually being reduced. That's just the way it is.
I have the joy, the honor, the privilege of getting to talk again with Mark Helprin. Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk to you about many things. We only have time to talk about a few things. I want to talk to you about art, about the state of art, past, present, and future, about literature, past, present, and future. You have elected in your life to write novels, to write fiction. Let's start first, maybe, with when did you decide to do that? When you were a boy, I know you had literary longings. Talk about that.
Oh, that's simple. And it begins, as so many things do, with my father. who went to Paris right after he was graduated from college. He was Columbia class of 28, although it's a little late because he went for 2 years in business school at NYU before that. And then he transferred to Columbia. He went to Paris, and he wanted to be an artist in Paris. It didn't work out.
A painter, visual artist.
Painter, yes. And he was always really good at drawing and painting. And he did that as a hobby throughout his life. But anyway, when he was in Paris, he saw that all the books didn't have hard covers, as French books then did not. Some do now, quite a lot do. But they didn't have hard covers. American books all had hard covers. So he came back to New York eventually, and he had a friend whose name was Herb Alexander. I don't know how he met Herb. I think
it's pronounced Herb.
Herb, yes. He was a greenie, and my father said to him, "Look, in France, they don't have hardcovers on books. You could probably save a lot of money." Now, Herb was in publishing, and he said, "Yeah, we could save a lot of money." And Herb started a company called Pocket Books, which is the first paperback company in America. Because of that, we got Simon & Schuster's entire production every year. A truck would bring, cases and cases
Your
of
father,
books.
your family,
Yeah,
would get every Simon & Schuster book delivered to your home.
that's correct. Because Herb started Pocket Books, which is a great success, and it was my father's suggestion. Well, Herb came to visit us once when I was 7, and in second grade, the head of my primary school, whose name was Ethel Daniels, who, by the way, figures in The Oceans and the Stars, because she was responsible for the rape of a little girl. Because she got angry at her, and the girl left the classroom. And anyway, I won't go into that. But and she was also the daughter of Josephus Daniels, Wilson's Secretary of War, and she was a lesbian with a woman named Sarah Sheridan, who was one of Philip Sheridan's, the Union cavalry generals.
So we're talking about these actual people, not the
Yes.
figures in your book, The Oceans and the Stars.
No, but
Yeah,
I
but the
put
people.
Ethel Daniels in.
Yeah.
Sarah Sheridan was one of Sheridan's illegitimate daughters. I think part Indian too, American Indian. But anyway, I told a lot of stories when I was in school, and Miss Daniels said, "I want to write your stories down." So she would take me at recess when I didn't get to play. I would have to sit there and dictate to her. And she wrote it all in her schoolmarm's handwriting and then gave it to my parents. My father showed it to Herb Alexander. I was 7, and Herb, who was that time was a big executive at Simon & Schuster because he was the head of Pocket Books, said, "I would like you to write 2 books for Golden Books," which is the children's book thing. One on Abraham Lincoln, who I was in love with at the time, very enthused about Lincoln, and the other a novel, a fiction book.
So you're 7 years old.
7 years old.
This is around 1954.
Yep. I was offered a 2-book contract.
You were offered a 2-book deal.
Right.
At age 7.
Yes, at age 7. My father said no. He's not going to do it, because my mother had been a child actress, and it was very bad for her to have done that. And you can, by the way, now we have all these revelations about Disney child actresses. Well, anything Disney, I always hated Disney, but they had all these problems. My mother too was almost ruined as a child. Anyway, I was doing that way back then at age 7, and it seemed to me that that's what I was going to do.
Before you get into that, because I want to get into that, but just to dilate for a second, you say that at age 7 you were always telling stories.
Yes.
What kind of stories and why? What was it about you, if you can remember, that you would just be telling stories? Obviously fictional stories.
Yeah. And not just fictional stories, but actually, just talking a lot.
You were garrulous.
Yeah, I would say things about everything, and also including making up stories. And I would entertain other kids by telling them stories. That was how I coped with being really strange.
No, I think that's what made you strange.
No, and that's how I was strange, and that's my defensive mechanism, is to tell stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at age 7, you're offered a 2-book contract. Your father says, Ixnay.
Right.
When do you write again? Do you keep writing?
Oh, I kept on writing that, and throughout school, secondary school, I was the editor of my literary magazine. And by the way, this may sashay into another topic that you mentioned we should talk about. When I was the editor of the literary magazine, I made a commandment, and I said, okay, no stories will be accepted. And I was talking about high school students, right? No stories will be accepted if they have cigarettes, alcohol, coffee, or cars. Because that was all the kids were just writing about those things. That was their idea of being grown up or sophisticated. Cigarettes, drinking, smoking, fast cars, whatever. I said, I don't want that. Use your imaginations, do something else. And then in
You
college,
sound like a literary martinet.
it's something that that brings up another thing.
Doesn't everything?
Yeah, everything does, yes. Everything's connected. When I was being interviewed for a job at Harvard, the English department, in those days they were somewhat better than they are now, assembled in Warren House, which is the headquarters of the English department. And they asked me about how I would teach. And I said, you teach by example. You show your students what they should do.
Were you a graduate student at this point at Harvard?
No, I was. This was for a real job, professorship, assistant professorship. And they said, okay. And I had a whole bunch of things saying what I would do. It was very complicated, et cetera. And then something came up, and I said, when I taught here before as a graduate student, there was a kid whose name was Roger. And all he wrote these 80-page things about masturbation. I said, and
I think you're confusing him with Philip Roth.
Well, he was confusing himself with Philip Roth. And I said, I would say to him, Roger, and this was thinking back to when I was the martinet in my literary magazine, Roger, I don't want any stories about masturbation, period. So then a professor there, who was the master of Adams House, Eliot House, I think, and it doesn't matter. His name was Kiley. And he said, he was very hostile to me. And he said, you tell Roger you can't write any stories about masturbation, but you said that you would lead by example. See, and he thought he was going to get me that way. You said you would lead by example, not by, and I said, yes, my example is I don't write stories about masturbation. But anyway, you talked about being a martinet.
Yeah.
Certain things, you do have to lay down some rules. You want to lead by example.
Yeah.
As if in the military. You lead by your example. You lead by being ahead. In Israel, the motto is "Follow me," but you also have to have rules that you enforce.
Sure.
There has to be some authority if you're going to run an organization or a literary magazine, or teach a class.
I don't know how we got here.
I don't
We were
either.
talking about, we're talking about your choice to write novels.
Yeah.
The idea that the novel is the form that in which you want to express your art. When did you decide, because it's one thing to write, but when did you decide that's what you wanted to do into the future? Did you make that decision at any point in the 70s? Your first novel is Refiner's Fire, but you had written short stories since much before that.
In the 60s. I started in 1963 when, as a high school, with my literary magazine, there was a guy who was the father of a classmate of mine. His name was Jack Kahn, or technically his name was Eli Jacques Kahn, Jr., and he was a New Yorker writer. And he saw my stories in the literary magazine, and he said, you should go see my sister. She's an editor at Harper and Row. And her name was Joan Kahn. She was a very famous editor. And so at 17, I went down to see her at Harper and Row, and I gave her a story. And they had all the readers at Harper and Row read it. And I still have the report on it. And it said, one of the people said, someday he may be like James Joyce, but now he is just a pup trying to bark. Okay? That was my first contact with publishing. I thought at that point I can write a book at 17, right? But in Dove of the East, I think one of the stories I did write in high school is published in Dove of the East. And in college, I kept on writing stories and submitting them to the New Yorker, to the Atlantic, et cetera, and getting rejection slips, but encouraging rejection slips. My father once wrote a story that he submitted to the New Yorker, and the rejection slip said, "Sorry, it didn't quite make it up the stairs." And he said that was so precious. He said he never submitted one to them again, but he did publish stories in other magazines. But anyway, eventually, when I was a senior in college, the New Yorker took 2 stories. And then I was on my way. And then I thought, well, I can maybe actually make a living doing this.
What was behind your thinking or your ambition? Did you have literary heroes as a young man?
Yes. I mean, I just read and read and read and read. When we lived in Jamaica, I went through the whole library. I was particularly interested in the Irish literature, particularly short stories, because that was the genre that I could do at that age. And I would just read all day. Just in The Oceans of the Stars, the French lycéens on the ship are girls who were on their field trip, big field trip, and they just spend the whole day reading. And that's what I used to do as a child.
Were you aware of yourself, or did you want to be part of a literary tradition? Did you have a sense of that you want to be part of the Western canon?
Very much so.
You did.
Very much so. And in fact, when I sold my first 2 stories to the New Yorker, I had a magnificent editor named Rachel Mackenzie, long gone. She was born of missionaries in China in the 19th century, and she was fantastic editor. The editing there was great at the time. And I went down there, and they took me to lunch. She took me to lunch at the Algonquin, where the round table used to be. And then we went back and worked on the stories in the New Yorker. And I felt that I had in fact entered a tradition. And at that time, I was also reading Carlos Baker's biography of Hemingway, because it had just come out. And I thought, well, maybe in those days it was different. The literature was different then. People weren't writing according to ethnicity, and they weren't. It wasn't. Everything wasn't about one particular political subject or not. It was still the old way. And I thought, well, this is a wonderful way to be. I can be like this. I didn't want to be like Hemingway because of all his problems and faults, but I thought I might settle in comfortably. Also, in those days, and I thought this would apply to me, that when you got a publisher, you stuck with that publisher. My first publisher was Knopf, and I did my first 2 books there. And since we knew the Cheevers very well, and his publisher was Knopf.
John Cheever.
Yeah, John Cheever. I thought, well, this is going to be the rest of my life, just as it was with him and with Updike. He and Updike had an arrangement with Knopf. They were paid almost a salary because the payments of their books were spread out, so they wouldn't be in too high a tax bracket. It evened out. And I thought, well, that's I got my first 2 books with Knopf. I'll keep on doing it. But then publishing changed, and it became corporatized. And I fought against the criticism of that. I said, this is okay. It's the market. This is what it should be. But it was actually very destructive. It was better when publishers didn't make so much money, when they published things because they loved them, now, if you submit a book to a publisher, it has to go through all these committees, marketing, publicity, et cetera. It's like a sort of a communist factory cell.
Gauntlet of jackasses.
Yeah, exactly. It's not what it used to be. Was an editor would say, "I love this book." In fact, I submitted a book when I was a graduate student to Houghton Mifflin, to a woman named Dorothy de Santillana. It was a famous editor at Houghton Mifflin at the time. And it was my first book of short stories. I gave it to her, and I had been submitting shorts. I had, at that time, I had published a couple stories in the New Yorker, so I wanted to publish a book of short stories. I gave it to her, and she called me in, and I went down to 2 Park Street, which is where Houghton Mifflin was at the time. And they had a cage elevator, as in France, you know, the just metal elevator. I went up to her office. I think there was a fireplace in the office, but her assistant brought tea and cookies, you know, on china. And she said, "I have wonderful news for you. We're going to publish your book." And I was a graduate student at that time, and I was in heaven. And I thought, this is magnificent. I went home. I told my wife. I told my parents. I told all my friends. It was the greatest thing. 2 weeks later, she called me and she said, you got to come in again. And I came in. I thought, well, maybe we'll be editing the way I did at the New Yorker. And she said, "I have some very bad news for you." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, I'll have Austin Olney." He was the head of Houghton Mifflin at the time, trade. And so Austin Olney came down in the cage elevator, and he said to me, "I'm sorry, but we're not going to publish your book." And I said, "But you said you were." And he said, "I know, we're not going to." I forgot the reason that he gave. I don't know what it was. And there I had been in heaven, and then suddenly I was cast down. So what I did was I walked across Boston Common and then across the Public Garden to the Atlantic Monthly Press. And this shows you the resilience of youth. You see, now I'd probably be so depressed I'd commit suicide. But then I just walked across the Commons and the Public Garden, and I climbed over an iron fence because I didn't want to take a sideway to the entrance. I climbed over this fence. I had the manuscript in my hand, and I saw in the Atlantic Monthly Press building a guy on the second floor who was standing at the window picking his nose. And I said, he must be the boss. So I went into the building and I said, I knew who it was. I thought that must be him. So his name was Robert Manning. And I said, "Is Mr. Manning in?" And the secretary said, "Do you have an appointment?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, I'm afraid you have to make an appointment." I said, "Well, he's in there. He's not doing anything. He's standing at the window picking his nose." And she said, "You can't say that." And I said, "Well, I just did." And she said, "Well, I'm sorry, you have to have an appointment." And I said, "Look, he's there." And she wouldn't give it. I said, "Tell him that Professor Morrison sent me." Now, Professor Morrison had sent me. He said, when he recommended Mrs. de Santillana, he also recommended Robert Manning. That was Theodore Morrison, who was the associate of Robert Frost, whose wife had a long affair with Robert Frost, who had a very tragic life, and he was a great professor of writing at Harvard. And I had been his student. And so she told him, "Manning, Professor Morrison has sent this kid." So he said, okay, because he couldn't turn down Professor Morrison because he thought it was Samuel Eliot Morrison, the great naval historian who wrote the Two-Ocean War. He was an admiral, Admiral Morrison.
I hope somebody's taking notes.
Yeah. And he was their leading moneymaker. See? So he thought it was that Morrison.
Right.
I went up and I gave him my manuscript, and as a brash kid, I said, "Here, these are short stories. They were going to publish it at Houghton Mifflin. You should publish it." He said, "Okay, well, I'll read it," etc. And then when he found out, he must have asked Samuel Eliot Morrison, "Did you send?" And Samuel Eliot Morrison must have said, "I never heard of this kid." They kept my manuscript for about 4 months, just as as in revenge, and then sent it back to me and said, "Rejected." I don't know how he got there, but it was different then than it is now. Now, it's all politicized, it's all racialized, sexualized, ethnicized, it's totally different.
I mean, what we're talking about a couple things here. First of all, when you talk about coming up in the 60s, there was a literary world. There was a respect for literary fiction. Mm-hmm. And of course, there were many great writers. You've mentioned a few of them, Cheever and Updike writing in the New Yorker, Updike coming out with a book a year by Alfred Knopf. There was this world into which one would hope to enter. I mean, as a writer in the 80s, was catching the tail end of that world. It still existed. And so you did have a sense of that you wanted to be a writer.
Absolutely.
You didn't just fall into it. You appreciated the tradition. But what's always interesting and sad to me is that the world keeps changing, so that you think you're entering something that will continue to exist as you've seen it in the decades. You've seen it, but it changes, and that world is no longer around. There was a heyday of the novel in America, and I don't know exactly when it went away, but you think 5 minutes ago everybody was talking about Updike and Mailer and Bellow and somehow that slowly went away.
Yeah, I have a sort of an date for that, for when it went away, and it's very interesting. When you were at my house, I showed you my autographed copy of Ulysses. Remember? And the front cover and the title page are ripped off, and Joyce autographed it in the back where it says "Printed for Sylvia Beach." And the reason the covers were ripped off was because my father brought it back to America. He got it signed. And in order to get it to America, he had to bring it in secretly because it was forbidden in America. And by the way, I'm not a fan of that book, to say the least.
Then we can continue to be friends.
Yes, okay. And I think the date was when the Supreme Court, or maybe it wasn't the Supreme Court, whichever appeals court or whatever, said, yeah, you can publish this book, and because it has artistic merit. Now, there's very, very fine line here between free speech and free expression, et cetera.
Yeah.
But in the same way, when the Supreme Court said, well, pornography when you see it,
right.
There should be standards. That was the first chipping away of the first emergence of the idea that, well, we don't need standards, and they're too oppressive, and we can start chipping. But then it became the slippery slope, totally. And the next that I remember in that sequence was Peyton Place, which is a book published by a woman named, I'm sorry, she was of Greek origin.
You're
Grace,
sorry?
Yes.
I'm sorrier.
Yeah, I bet you are. Grace Metaliou. She wrote this book called Peyton Place, which is all about sex, and it was a tawdry book.
It's a propagandistic, kind of trashy novel.
And then in the 60s, there was Jacqueline Suzanne, and it just got worse and worse and worse until when I was publishing with Knopf, and that was quite a while ago, and it started in the 70s. I remember some woman wrote a book all about having sex with a bear. And this was a big hit, and that's called bestiality. Not bestiality, but bestiality. And I thought at the time, I guess I was retrograde, but yeah, I was and I am. I thought, wait a minute, here's a book about animal sex, and it's reviewed seriously, and people are reading it as a. And then there was Erica Jong, or Erica Jong, pronounced without the Dutch, writing all these books about this sex stuff and everything. And I think maybe the final straw for me when it was really gone was my agent was the agent of the woman who actually wrote 50 Shades of Grey. And it was supposed to be a secret. No one knew who she was, but I knew who she was because the book she wrote for my agent, who did not agent 50 Shades of Grey, but she agented this woman's first book. It was about her father, who was a Nazi. And the book came out and had swastikas all over it. See, it was a memoir of her father. She loved her father. Okay, even though he was a Nazi, I can see you love your father. There's a reason for it. But I thought that's kind of pushing it. And then she really pushed it with 50 Shades of Grey, evidently.
It's interesting because we're talking about, as usual in our conversations, we're talking about many things at once. We're talking about the free market, and we're talking about the idea that the free market, of which both of us are proponents, basically, nonetheless requires standards, just as, you can't have a republic unless you have a virtuous citizenry. It's not just about everybody gets a vote. If the people voting don't have some sense of virtue, you can elect Adolf Hitler. If the free market doesn't have some sense of virtue, you just get better and cheaper drugs and pornography. And that seems to me what happened in the entertainment world and in the world of writing. And a lot of people with great literary talent rode that tiger. Joyce is a classic example with Ulysses, but I think particularly guilty of this are John Updike, and many others, Saul Bellow. But it's interesting. I mean, that when you think of Updike's first books, and then you think of Couples, and he I don't know if he made a conscious decision that I can make a lot of money riding the zeitgeist or marrying myself to the zeitgeist, but that's what he did.
Oh, I could explain that one, because I knew him a little too, and I know exactly what happened with Couples, and that's this. In the 60s, most of you in this audience would probably remember there was a magazine called Ramparts, and it was a leftist magazine, anti-war magazine, anti-Vietnam War magazine. And they published an issue in which they solicited the views of leading intellectuals and others, writers, or filmmakers, whatever, about Vietnam. And very much like the issue of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Daedalus about what they called Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, in which there was not a single essay in favor of it. It was 2 volumes, and every essay was opposed to it. No other point of view.
It was virtue signaling.
It was. And the Ramparts thing, there was not a single entry of many, many, many in favor of the Vietnam War, except for one by John Updike. And they came down on him.
What year?
I don't know, 68, 69, I don't remember. They came down on him like a ton of bricks. And then he knew that he had to trim his sails. You see?
Well, he didn't need to. He chose to.
No,
if he wanted to succeed.
He needed to. See, you're thinking of Updike after decades of. At that time, he wasn't that well established, and
well, all I mean to say is that if he wanted to succeed in that world, he needed to trim his sails.
Yeah, exactly.
But he didn't need to choose to succeed in that world.
No, he was not. He could have said no. Yeah, he could have gone in a different direction, and that's what I did. I chose not to trim my sails, and that's where I'm. Here we are.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because when we're thinking of I wanted to talk about the state of literature, past, present, and future, and not only has the quality of fiction and literary fiction declined dramatically, that tradition seems to have gone away. But also, there just don't seem to be as many readers. It seems like I think you said this to me some years ago that you knew that you had picked an art form that was to some extent on the wane.
Yeah. Oh, I did say this. Again, it's my father, because I'm like an extension of my father, as we all are extensions of our parents. He, as a child, paid a nickel and saw for the first time a moving image, a train coming down a track in a Nickelodeon. And he was absolutely blown away by that. And what he said to me, and this was in 1975, after I had been divorced and I was miserable, and we were sitting at the bottom of our empty swimming pool in the winter to be out of the wind, and it was facing south, and it was white walls, made it tolerable to be in winter sitting there talking. And I was just absolutely miserable and didn't know what to do with my life. I was divorced, et cetera. And he told me this story, that he was blown away by the moving image. And then they had celluloid film with, the jerky films, and he thought that was magnificent. And then there was sound, and then the film stabilized and it wasn't jerky images. And then there was color. and then there was Technicolor, and then there was CinemaScope, and then there was television, etc. And he said to me, and he had never heard of Moore's Law.
In 1975, he said to you.
1975, he said, he had never heard of Moore's Law. He said, I've noticed throughout my life that the amount of information that can be transmitted in various forms, film and then video, etc., has doubled periodically, and it's getting denser and denser and denser. He said, so that the image now is much more translatable and portable, and you can the image is convenient, and it's going to take over from the word. And he said in 1975, I figure you have about 25 years until the image becomes dominant and the word recedes. Now he was off a bit, but I took that to heart, and I thought to myself, well, maybe I'll have 25 or 30 years in which people are still interested in the word rather than the image. And as we see now, things have been converted to communication, but largely by images. And you see people staring at their phones the way they do, and TikTok and all of that. And the word has receded, language has receded as a means of communication. Of course, it's still there, always will be. But as an art form, as a way of communicating en masse, it has receded in favor of the image. So I knew then that my time was limited.
Well, it's interesting because you just wrote a novel, and you've written another one not yet published or named, but great novels can still be written, and they're still being written. So we're really talking about the appetite, the market, the audience. Mm-hmm. I don't think they can ever disappear. The question is the details.
It's the monastery. It gets small. The audience gets smaller and smaller, and less appreciative, and more, if I dare say so, refined in the technical sense. Fewer and fewer people, and it's the monastery. They will be the words will be preserved, but the general audience and appreciation and power of it is gradually being reduced. That's just the way it is.
John Cheever, whom you knew personally and whom I did not know personally, but revered tremendously, because when I was about 19, I discovered his short stories. I remember him, maybe it was in a Paris Review interview or something, talking about this, and I wish I had the quote, I don't, but he was talking about how in novels and in the written word, something happens. We're capturing something intrinsic to what it means to be human, and there is no other way to capture it apart from words. I mean, he really had a very high view of fiction, and I really buy what he said. There is something about that images can't do the same thing.
Absolutely, for sure, and that's why I've stuck with it. And by the way, you once asked me, you were astounded that although I had known him since I was a little boy, that I've never read him, never read a single thing he's written. And part of the reason is that I'm not particularly happy with him, and you want to know why?
Well, I can guess, but I do want to hear you talk about it.
It's this: when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and there were riots all throughout the country. As it happened, my parents had invited John and Mary Cheever and an actor named Howard Da Silva, who played Benjamin Franklin in 1776, the musical on Broadway.
I was in that musical at Yale.
Were you?
I didn't play Ben Franklin. I played John Hancock.
Oh.
But, okay, so it's 1968.
1968.
Your parents have invited the Cheevers and
Howard Da Silva for, I hate to say the word. I don't like to say the words that sound, well, I'll say them like crunch, hunch, and this was brunch.
Right.
I don't like to say that word. At our house, we call it the B word.
Yeah.
I don't like the whole idea of brunch. I just don't like it. But they had invited them for that. It was a Sunday. So they came, and you could see the smoke in Ossining from buildings that were burning from our house, which is quite far away from it. And, we knew that throughout the country there were riots. And John and Mary Cheever were saying, oh, what can we do? It's just terrible, it's et cetera. And so someone, I don't remember the exact, some of the exact conversation I remember, someone said, what can we do? And my father said, well, we went out and we bought ammunition. And we did. And the Cheevers looked at us and they said, you did what? My father said, we bought ammunition. What for? My father said, well, to make sure we had enough ammunition. If someone comes up the driveway to burn down our house, we can shoot them. They were so horrified at that. And, my father was in the war. It's just not something. He said, well, what are we supposed to do? And we got into a big argument and discussion. Howard Da Silva, who was an old lefty from the 30s, what they call it 30s red, was also similarly very horrified by it. And when they left, it was not very nice. Well, he then wrote a book called Bullet Park.
John Cheever did.
Yes.
It's so sad that this man who wrote these really great short stories in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, he wrote some novels that are far below the artistic standard of his stories. Bullet Park is at the head of the pack.
Yeah, Bullet Park was, we used to, not at this house where the brunch was, but most of the time when we knew him, when I was growing up, we lived in a place called Brayton Park. This is called Bullet Park. He used to visit us in Brayton Park. This is called Bullet Park. And the father in the book was called Hammer. It begins with an H, like Helprin. And he had a son, and that was a book about that argument we had, and the father ends up killing the son because the father is a gun nut, right? And I thought that was pretty crappy. He's our guest, and so he writes a whole book, essentially.
Did you read Bullet Park?
I skimmed it.
Look, I read it, and if it's any consolation, it's not a good book.
I wouldn't imagine so. I don't think anyone's written a good book about my family. But
I think you've written eight books about your family, but
I have.
Not explicitly.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's why I was angry at him, and I was also angry at him because when I published my first book with Knopf, Dove of the East, I thought if he wrote a review for the New York Times Book Review, it would sell 10 billion copies.
Actually, I remember. Okay, you did share this story in our first conversation.
I see.
But look.
And he didn't. He was very cagey about it.
Yeah. No, it's just so funny when we know people personally versus read their work. And his first novel, The Wapshot Chronicle, yep, is for me, it's wonderful, really wonderful. But they go downhill from there, his novels. But his early short stories, in some ways, they're a lot like your books. There's something there that he changes at the end. In the 60s, he changes.
Can I tell you another story about him? Since it's funny that he's a person of great interest, and there are a lot of stories about him. When he wrote, he pronounced it as Faulkner, or most people pronounce it.
Now I forced you to tell this story too in our first.
Shall I not tell it?
I don't think you should tell it.
Okay.
No, people should watch our first interview where you tell this is one of the funniest stories ever. So this will get people to watch our first conversation because it sounds like something you would make up, but I know you didn't make it up.
I didn't.
It's hilarious. It's hilarious. But no, you tell it in our first conversation. This is our fourth, amazingly. But it's a funny thing when you know someone, and it's always heartbreaking when they don't live up to their art. It's an interesting thing.
Most people don't.
Most people don't.
Yeah.
You do. That's what's interesting.
Well,
is there's something extremely consistent about who you are and what you write. It's not. It's not a coincidence that your books are about people that are like you. You value certain things. You write about those things.
I bet that there are people who would say I don't. Well, I can't think of who might, but I'm sure there are plenty of people with a low opinion of me who would say I don't. And this is what happens: is someone always comes out of the woodwork to say, "Well, he screwed me,"
Yeah.
You know, or he was dishonest, or look, I've done some. I can think of some actually. I can think of things that I've done for which I have great shame.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. I don't really mean that. I mean just I want to touch on at least two of your books before we run out of time. The first is one of your very recent ones, In Sunlight and in Shadow, which takes place in 1947.
Late 40s, yeah, and also, of course, during the war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, but right. But somehow 47 is the year of the book.
Yeah,
right. You know, it's a really, really beautiful book. I have it here. Why don't we start with another banal question? Why is it titled In Sunlight and in Shadow?
That's very interesting because I was criticized for that and attacked. I'll tell you why. There's a song, it's Danny Boy, right? And the line in it is in sunshine and in shadow. Now, I was talking to, at the time the book came out, to an Irishman, American of Irish descent, and he said, "Yes, that's a really sentimental song," because he was anti-sentiment. And I said to him, "Yeah, it's maybe sentimental, but not if your son didn't come back from the First World War." And if you think of it in that context, which is why it was written, it's a deeply moving song, and it's very beautiful. The tune is beautiful, and the lyrics are beautiful when you understand the context, which is about the Irish boy who didn't come back because he was killed in the war. But this is not in sunshine and in shadow. In sunshine, it's in sunlight. And that is a homage, not an homage,
Right.
to two books. One by an Englishman who wrote a history of New York, and it's called In Sunshine and in Shadow. It's a photographic history. I've forgotten his name. And the other, a 19th century book, a sort of a Jacob Riis muckraking book about the great number of poor in New York in the 19th century. And that's called In Sunshine and in Shadow. And this book, which is about New York, is a homage to those two books. That's where the title comes from.
Well, you write a lot about light, so I think it's appropriate, for what it's worth, that you titled it In Sunlight and in Shadow. It really is. It's just extremely beautiful. There's so much we could say about it, but I recommend it very highly. But let me just say that there's one thing that one can't help but notice in much of your writing. You write about the past as though you knew it personally. There are passages in here that I just had to put the book down because I was absolutely buffaloed by how anyone could go into such detail about something. The protagonist of this book inherits a what is it? A leather business.
Yeah.
And you describe in 1947 the workings of this. It's not really a factory. It's a workshop. Mm-hmm. You describe it in such detail that it seems you had to have experienced it yourself. It really is astonishing detail. So I don't know if you think of it as a secret or if you can explain to us how it's possible for you to know the very detailed workings of a leather-making workshop in New York in the 40s.
Well, couple things. One, would enter that question by saying hitchhiking. And that's the reason I say that is in the 60s I used to hitchhike a lot, as a lot of people did. And every time I would get into a car with somebody, I would ask them questions about, what do you do? Tell me about it.
Right.
Et cetera. And I had amazing experiences hitchhiking. I hitchhiked with one guy who actually, he picked me up in outside of Boston, and we drove to New York through Rhode Island because he had to visit one of his shoe factories. He had gotten into the shoe business, this was leather, in St. Louis, where he sat opposite the young Tennessee Williams sewing shoes. And he was now very, very successful. He was an industrialist, really. And he took me on a tour of his shoe factory. So I hadn't even thought of that in terms of this. It didn't even occur to me. But I just wanted to know everything about how you made shoes and where the leather comes from, and you know, how the stitching is and how it works, et cetera, et cetera. And every time I would hitchhike, I would ask people about what they do, how they live, whatever. And I do that with everything. And then you remember it, and then you can do further reading about it, et cetera, to make it something that's whole and substantive and real.
So you're not averse to doing research for the purposes of verisimilitude in your fiction?
Not at all. In fact, I get embarrassed if I make a mistake, you know, if there's something that's wrong. Just like in The Oceans and the Stars, when John Lehman said, we don't call them greatcoats, we call them bridge coats.
Yeah.
That makes me feel very embarrassed.
Are there any mistakes in this book?
I'm sure there are.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I think you overuse the word luffing.
Possibly. You know what word I overuse all the time?
No.
It's even. The word even. If you did a concordance and you look for the word even, I try to get it out of there, but it's everywhere. It's all over the place.
There's so much great stuff in this book. You, at one point, one of the things that really just drove me nuts, I thought, I can't believe this. I've got to ask him about this. You refer to the price of, I don't know, an egg cream or something in the on page 646. You say that the price of a celery tonic and a pretzel in 1947 was the same as that in the 1920s. The character is remarking on this. Mm-hmm. Okay, how do you know the price of a celery tonic and a pretzel in either of those decades? How do you know that they were the same price? Where does this come from?
I must have looked it up, but you see, part of it is that we never recovered from the stock market crash until the early 50s. And then there was the war, where there was a burst of inflation, but then it subsided, and then after the war there was inflation. But the price levels, of course, change. And in general, if you were to buy an apartment in Manhattan, before the housing press after everyone came back from the war, it would be the same price as you would have paid in 1926. 20 years after. And I must have looked those things up.
Well, it's funny. It's so much of what you write is like that. I think, well, you weren't there in the 20s or the first, so it's extraordinary. Yeah. There's one funny thing. You talk about the color of the ceiling in Grand Central. Obviously, it's the constellation, and you remark in this book that the sky with the constellations, it's green, and you say, but the sky is not green. The sky is blue. What did you figure out why? Because I don't think you say it in the book. Why is it painted green in on the ceiling of Grand Central?
No, I don't know why it is. It's a very interesting point. It's green. It's a green sky.
I think it's. I've seen maps and paintings and things from around the era that Grand Central would have been made, and they seem to have a habit of painting the sky that kind of. It's a type of green. I can't think what the name it is, but I've seen it before. So it sort of evokes an era, but I guess I don't know why. Am I mistaken in thinking that in the Paris Review interview that you did in 1993, which I read in 1993, that you said then that you had this crazy idea of buying Grand Central and turning the main concourse into the world's largest studio apartment?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you help us understand what you were referring to, why you said that?
Well, I love Grand Central, and it's a great room, and it's very tranquil. And I thought I could get rid of the information booth and then just put a bed right in the center of it. And you could have a kitchen off where they had the ticket booths and things like that. And it would be so quiet and so tranquil that it would just be terrific.
Well, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But nobody would actually say that they wanted to do that. Did you have some kooky scheme? Or is there anything behind this other than fancy?
Well, when I mentioned that when I wanted John Cheever to review the book in the New York Times Book Review, and I thought, and just shows you how crazy I could be anyway. I had in my contract for my first book, A Dove of the East, for which I got $5,000, which in today's dollars would be $50,000, which is a good price for it. I had a calculation of the royalties that I would get by computing the percentage times the sales of books and the price of the book. And I didn't stop. I went all the way up into the billions, as if everyone in China would buy that book. And I thought, well, if that happened, then I could buy Grand Central and make it into a studio apartment. Honest to God, honest to Betsy.
Yes, heavens to Betsy that you think that way.
Yeah. Thought that way.
Yeah. We in our last conversation we talked about the ineffable, the transcendent. There's a passage in the book In Sunlight and in Shadow. You say, one of the characters, I guess it's Harry, the protagonist, says, "I believe in God not as a manifestation of man, but as an omnipotent power. If he made the world in such a way that it results in the love I have for Catherine, I trust that he will take care and that all will come right in the end. His commandments are fundamental and of the heart and soul, even if man has drawn them out into orthodoxies of his own making in a forest of dry reeds. Sometimes a storm rises and flattens the reeds to open the world to the sky." And the person with whom you're speaking says, "With what theology exactly does that comport?" And the end, Harry's answer, "God's theology." "How justified and confirmed?" "By all nature, rich in life. I haven't arrived at this belief via reason. I was brought to it, carried like a child in benevolent arms." "That's heresy, of course." "Oh, you mean that though you yourself can speak to me and professors can teach me, God lacks these powers and is compelled to be forever mute and indirect. Who compels him?" Again, you are a theologian because you're not a theologian. You're a good theologian. So you
I stole from Voltaire, by the way, supposedly famous for being an atheist,
yeah.
who said, in terms of does God exist, and he said, "Toute la nature crie qu'il existe." All nature cries that he exists. This is Voltaire, supposedly the great atheist, right? All nature cries that he exists.
Yeah.
Everything that we see, everything that we are, the fact
Yeah.
that we're alive, it all cries that.
But so you refer to these dry orthodoxies. It's interesting to me because that's the problem with theology and with orthodoxy, is that it can limit God. It can really miss God in its attempt to pin him down.
Yeah.
And you work in your fiction against that.
Well, that's what Hasidism is about. You see, Hasidism is a movement in Europe, and starting in the 17th century, in which the rabbis rebelled against too strict a Talmudic, which is
Legalism.
Legalism, right? And legalism is a very insulting word, because it's what happened with the Talmud and the Mishnah and all those books. That was a way of transporting a whole country that was in exile and keeping it alive. It was not just theology; it was also a form of nationalism. But anyway, nonetheless, that has a constricting effect if you overdo it. And Hasidism was a reaction to that, which was somewhat like Protestantism, which said, no, wait a minute, we're not going to necessarily follow the dictates of the papacy. It said we're going to have a more direct connection with God. That always springs up whenever you have any kind of institutional embrace of something like theology or religion. Then it would tend to overstep its bounds, and you get a reaction to it. And that's Hasidism. That's the tradition I come from. I mentioned last night the Lubavitcher Rebbe and how I had direct connection with him, not even of my own doing, but that's what my ancestors were, and that's atavistic. What that theology, if you can call it that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you're reaching for truth, and when you're reaching for truth, it's inevitable that you want a personal connection. But of course, with the personal connection to God comes the danger of inventing God, of subjectivity, and that's always there. But that's the price of freedom, isn't it?
That's what you have to deal with. That's the challenge. And in part that you skipped is he says, if teachers can teach me and people can do this, and Western Union can send a telegram, you mean God can't directly communicate with me? He's limited. Western Union can send me a telegram, but God can't say anything to me directly? It has to be through an intermediary? No. Why would that be?
People are threatened by that because they think, how dare you say that God spoke to you?
It can go off the rails.
Of course it can. But there's some people for whom it must. They're afraid of that, But I mean, really, it's no different than being afraid of freedom. There's a paradox, that you can't.
Can I tell you a story about paradox?
Yes, and then probably we have to end. I hate it. Our time flies.
We'll end on paradox. I had a great professor of Jewish history at Harvard. His name was Yosef Yerushalmi. Sadly, he's gone. In fact, I don't have a single professor that I ever had who is still alive. They're all dead. And I have my only friend who from college, whom I'm still friends with, came to a class with me, and it was called the Jews of Muslim Spain, and he came as a visitor. And Yerushalmi, throughout this lecture, sometimes you have words that you repeat a lot and you can't get off, and he would say paradox a lot. That this was a paradox, that was a paradox, and every time he would say paradox, my friend would say quack quack, quack quack, and Yerushalmi would look up and he would say, who's that? And he would say, so and so and so and so, and this is a paradox. And my friend would go quack quack, quack quack. So every time anyone says paradox, if I can, I didn't with you, but I at least tell the story, I say quack quack.
Yes. Nonetheless, you were telling me a story about your friendship with Zero Mostel, where animal sounds also figure in, but we're out of time. You did know Zero Mostel. Is there anybody you didn't meet?
Oh yeah, plenty. But I knew Zero Mostel from the time I was a baby until he died, and he taught us. Well, should I do it?
I don't know. I don't think so.
No. Okay. We can't go.
I don't know. It's just too. We're out of time, and I know that if you even lean in that direction, we're gonna skate out onto thinner ice. There will be a next time. Yeah. And Mark Helprin, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's an honor to have this time with you.
Thank you very much. You should ask me all these wonderful questions.
Thank you.